Let's look at if we could maybe bring Iraq and Lebanon into relationship on this. There was a lot of one of the kind of bright spots, and again, we got to be very place specific. And I do think that the uprisings in Haiti and Chile and Ecuador and so on really did have in Colombia had a very explicitly anti-neoliberal sort of revival of Caribbean and Latin left. But the movements in the Middle East were different. They definitely had a lot to do with some very specific local political arrangements, which obviously all places did. But I'm just saying, I don't think you can draw a one-to-one. I'm aware of the distinctions. However, one of the things that really was extraordinary about some of the movements we were seeing a couple of months ago in Iraq and Lebanon was it really did seem to be something of a pushback against sectarian, identitarian politics, and something of a, we get this. Look, there's enormous income inequality. There's enormous corruption. There's local capital political elites that, have relationships with international institutions. They suck the economy dry, and then they sort of play various low-level patronage patronage games with Shia and Sunni and so on. And we're sort of over it. We're kind of having our 99% moment with the local, factional politics. And I remember I read an interview with a former Egyptian foreign minister who struck a very optimistic note. He said, these protests are the biggest blow against sectarian politics we've seen in quite some time. And whether or not they succeed, this is an opening out of the sort of, really horrific divisions that have been played by outside powers and cultivated by, Middle East monarchies and dictatorships. Where does that really positive note fit in with how Lebanon and Iraq are responding to this crisis?
Well, I think in the immediate term, Corona has struck fear into these societies, so a lot of this protest and has fallen by the wayside as people, again, focus on themselves. You've seen a variety of different responses. People I know in Iraqi Kurdistan, they just gone straight onto lockdown and trying to avoid things. And sort of information and, our knowledge of how the corona is spreading especially in Iraq, but also Lebanon and Syria, is very limited. I mean, people are talking about a hidden disaster. I think, officially there are 700 cases in Iraq, but people believe it to be a lot higher because, where do we get the information from? And of course, the way that it's spread to these societies has been, you've had pilgrimage, military movements, people coming from Iran, for example, for jobs, because, the economy is so dire. People, sneaking across the border into Iraq to work in construction project. So, a lot of the sort of politicking that was taking place before the corona virus seems to have frozen, at least in the short term. And, I do think, we've seen a blow to sectarianism. I mean, Iraq, I know as a better example, that's certainly the case. People are tired, or at least certain communities have become tired of sectarianism. But on the flip side, the actual institutional structures of patronage are still relevant. So even if you're sick of the system, you still have to participate in the system in order to get yourself. So, people turning against the system of, the sectarian nature of politics is an important start. But until the actual institutional basis of sectarian rule is dismantled, or at least, we see a serious blow struck to it, I find it very difficult to see how we're going to overcome it, because, people have to look after themselves in the short term, and whatever they might think. And, people have been having these conversations. It's not recently that people have been having these conversations about, sectarianism is kind of destructive and things like that. But at the same time, you need to get that paycheck. You need to get that position in the ministry. And if that means you have to play your identity, if that means you have to play your connections, you're going to do it. We look at a country like Lebanon; its entire political structure is constructed on sectarian identities. In Iraq, it's not formally like that. There's no law that says a Kurd has to be president and a Shia has to be prime minister and so on and so forth. But that's how it is. That's the convention that has grown up. And there's a whole basis of networks that exist that have to be dismantled before we can really overcome sectarianism. So yes, I'm more hopeful than I was, let's say 5-6 years ago, that we might sort of surpass these things. But we have to be, very realistic about, what sustains sectarianism. Sectarianism is not some kind of malady of the Middle Eastern mind, whereby they're so, backwards that that they're obsessed with, a battle that took place 1,400 years ago, right? It is because of the actual institutional nature of politics in these societies and how they're arranged. So COVID-19.
Absolutely. I mean, there's people on the right and who would say they're on the left here who are very. They seem to want to import those kind of Lebanese models, which are such a disaster. So no, there's nothing essential about anyone. And this is obviously a destructive politics wherever it forms that needs to be uprooted in a social democratic direction. So, and maybe if I could note the purely speculative, the immediate crisis reinforces just whatever you can do to survive, obviously, but maybe, just as who is on the front line of militia fights is also determined by class position and so on. Maybe the response to Corona also becomes another, like, oh, that's great, we're all Kurds, but who got the tests? Yeah. It becomes yet another lesson on how these systems are actually working for the great vast majority.
Yeah, I think that's definitely it's definitely the case. And what we're going to see, I mean, there are also massive refugee flows in these countries. In Syria, in northwestern Syria, you're probably going to have this huge humanitarian disaster because you can't social distance in a refugee camp. And we have refugees in Turkey, we have refugees in internally displaced people in Syria, we have refugees in Lebanon, refugees in Iraq, and this is going to be a hotbed for the spread of this virus. It's going to hit the most vulnerable people. And it's going to, it doesn't give a damn about whether you're a Sunni Shia or a Kurd or whatever particular sect you are. These hotbeds will spread out to other places. And to tie this with the United States, this is one of the reasons why Donald Trump's stunt to end funding to the World Health Organization, whatever critiques we might have of the World Health Organization, every single UN institution should and must be critiqued. They have a lot of problems, but on a practical level, these organizations are critical to, these refugees in the Middle East. And this is going to be, I fear that this is going to be, and a lot of people fear that this is going to be, we're going to see a big explosion of these COVID cases amongst refugees. And that will not remain restricted to the refugee population. That will spread out to other populations. People can't insulate themselves. Like just as in the United States, there is a lot of belly aching about, why should we give aid to undocumented workers? Well, even from your own selfish perspective, do you think the virus gives a damn about whether it's an undocumented worker? So, this is not only selfishness, this is self-destructiveness when it comes down to, end of the day. So,
no, it's a pure delusion and nihilism.
Spitefulness.
And spite, of course. It's disgusting.